So let's just go ahead and get started cooking with herbs. Of course, I do work for Iowa State Extension and Outreach, and so we are, bringing research-based information to you. My email address is there if anyone wants to get a hold of me, and you can also get a hold of anyone on the committee, and they know how to reach me as well. Maybe I can start my video again if you wanted that to be on. Okay, so here's just a few of the things we're going to talk about. Caitlin already introduced it, and isn't that a pretty picture of some cantaloupe there with some mint leaves on it? And so we won't get to do as many fun things as we would have had we been doing this in person. I actually bought a few herb plants and brought them home, and my husband kind of looked at me really puzzled, like too early to put them in the ground. And I said, well, I'm doing a presentation on herbs. And again, he looked at me really puzzled, like, won't it be online? What are you going to do with those? I don't know why I bought them. I guess I just needed to get in the mood or in the groove of thinking about herbs and gardening and so forth. And they are wonderful to have in the garden, either in pots on your deck or out in your garden in a special herb bed, whatever you have. And if you just have one type of herb or multiple, my favorite thing to do, honestly, is just to walk past them, rub my fingers through them, and get the fresh aroma of all the herbs. So we're just going to talk, before we get into the cooking part, we will talk just a little bit about some common annual and perennial herbs. And so I'll just bring some up on the screen, and just, I know a lot of you that logged in, because I could see you were master gardeners already, so you obviously know what an annual is, but not everyone does. So annuals are herbs or any plant that you have to plant every year, and they're not going to come up again the following year. Now, the tricky thing about herbs that I found is sometimes in the gardening centers, an herb might be listed as a perennial, which would mean it would come back year after year, but it's really not a perennial necessarily for us in this part of Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, because we're colder. It may not be a perennial for us. And then do keep in mind that you can also pick up an herb plant at a garden center or start it yourself from seeds, and you can have those in pots indoor all year long if you have a nice sunny place to put them. So I'm going to have you put in the chat box what herb this is, if you know. This is an annual herb.
Renee, while they're writing that in there, we do have somebody that asked about wild mint, and if you know if all wild mints are edible.
I have to tell you, I don't know anything about wild mint. I know that when you grow mint, it goes wild, but something that's actually called wild mint, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with. Okay, did we get this herb identified?
Everybody thinks it's basil.
They are right. This is one of the easiest to grow annual herbs in our part of the country, probably almost anywhere. So that's just regular basil. And what about this one? What's this?
I see a bunch now. They say it's dill.
And they are correct. So this would be dill before it forms the seed head, before it goes to seed. So in the grocery store, when you buy dill weed, this is what you're purchasing. You're purchasing these fine little kind of feathery things that have been dried, and then as it grows, the seed head will develop on it. Now, dill is an annual. It's not a perennial, but we call it a reseeder, which means that when it goes to seed and the seeds fall into the soil, many years those seeds will regerminate and come back up as dill again. It doesn't necessarily happen every single year, but often dill reseeds, and if you till your garden, you might have dill coming up all over your garden. What about this one? What do you think this is?
While they're answering that, we did have somebody ask if all parts of dill are edible.
To my knowledge, all parts of dill are edible, but I will say that the stalk and even the little stems that the seeds come out on to form that seed head, they're pretty chewy. They're pretty tough. I don't know that, sometimes you put the whole seed head into, say, like a jar of dill pickles. Even after that has been pickled, it would still be pretty tough to chew. But as far as none of it, to my knowledge, is poisonous or anyway. So yes, you could eat all of it.
They're asking if you could put the stalk into a puree that you were making.
I've never tried that. I guess it would be trial and error. If you were going to put the stalk into puree, I would think you would want to cook it first, but I think you'd have to experiment with it. The stalk is very stringy and kind of tough.
All right. They all think this one is parsley.
And they are correct. This is flat leaf parsley. Of course, we've also all seen probably curly leaf parsley as well, and also a really easy annual herb to grow in our part of the country. What about this one? Oh, it says on the bottom what it is. Cheater here. That one is cilantro, isn't it? And parsley and cilantro look a little, flat leaf parsley and cilantro look a little bit alike, but you can see that the parsley has more pointed leaves and the cilantro a little bit more rounded. So again, cilantro also a really easy annual to grow in the Midwest. And then let's just talk briefly about perennials. Most of you probably know this, that a perennial is the original plant that will winter over and come back every spring. And so again, some of the herb perennials are fairly tender and may or may not come back again here in our Midwest climate. And I have had, I don't start seeds, so I usually am purchasing my perennials from a garden center or from a catalog or something. And my herbs that are labeled perennials, depending on the winter, sometimes they will come back from the original plant and sometimes they don't, and then I have to start over again. So you never quite know for sure how that's going to work out. But let's look at some perennial plants now, herb plants, and see if you know what they are. What do you think this one is?
Well, they're answering that one. Will you be covering about keeping herbs over the winter at all?
I will actually not, no.
Okay. Rosemary.
Very good, yes, that's, now this is one that occasionally I have had come back over the winter, but this year it did not. So I feel that it's fairly unpredictable. How about this one? What herb do you think that is?
They aren't quite as sure about this one. We have oregano, we have mint.
So yeah, it is kind of tricky. This is mint. I'll show you what that looks like. Let's see. Okay. So this is oregano. Now, I have noticed that oregano sometimes does have a slightly different look to than this. And in fact, the oregano that I have in my herb bed, I do sometimes get it mixed up with mint. So I understand why people weren't sure about that. This is a fairly small leafed oregano compared to like these mint leaves, but the oregano in my herb bed this would be when it is first starting to leaf out. The leaves do get quite a bit bigger than that. And oregano is one that I have always had winter over. It doesn't ever seem to kill off no matter how cold it gets that winter. So that's the oregano. There's the mint, as I already said. Do you know what this one is?
Well, they answer that one. We have somebody that commented Mexican oregano, marjoram, and Greek oregano seem to look similar.
I agree. And I don't actually have any of them in my herb beds, but you're right. And sometimes I can't tell without tasting them, honestly.
We have a couple people that think this is tarragon.
And they are correct. This is tarragon. We'll talk more about all of these herbs and cooking with them a little bit later, but that is also a really nice perennial for this part of the country. And what about this one?
I'm not sure I know what that one is. We've got nobody answering so far. Oh,
What?
We do have somebody that says lemon thyme and somebody that just says thyme.
Okay, so it is thyme. And I think it's just regular thyme, but it certainly could be lemon thyme too, because I think my lemon thyme has a little brighter look to it like this. I think this picture is deceiving. This photo is deceiving because it's a really close-up look of the leaves, isn't it? Making them look considerably bigger than what they are, because thyme leaves are very, very tiny. So I think that is understandable why people were confused about that. Now this one I think is a little easier.
They definitely are getting it faster. It's sage.
Yes, then this is just common sage. And of course, with many of these different types of herbs, both annuals and perennials, there are different varieties, aren't there? So there's a golden sage, there's all different types. There's a purple sage with the thyme. Somebody mentioned lemon thyme. There's different flavors of thyme, of mint, of basil, so many, and someone else had mentioned Mexican oregano. So we do know that there's different variations of each of these basic plants. So I think I may have already, well, no, I guess I asked you kind of what herbs do you like to cook with, but I am interested also in what herbs do you plant or purchase at the farmer's market? Is it a different list? Or would you like to plant? And this again in the photo is a picture of rosemary.
Turmeric, winter savory, one of them is my wife is Asian, so she likes curry, lemongrass, and turmeric. Chives, tarragon, thyme. I like to plant them all. Currently, I don't have any.
They are a lot of fun. They really are. They're a lot of fun to grow. They're a lot of fun to just enjoy the aroma, have in your kitchen, in a pot, cook with, preserve, all of the above. Okay, so this is a presentation on cooking with herbs, but we're going to just touch on a few things related to growing. This again is thyme, and it looks different now from this view, doesn't it? You can see how really kind of tiny those leaves are, and you don't have to have a lot of garden space. You can put them just in a container. Here's sage, and you can see how big this looks like it has gotten, like a big bush. So if you do have some of these herbs planted outside, they do get fairly big. If you keep them in a pot and keep them cut back a little bit, they are a little bit more manageable in a pot. Here's a different way of planting them where you have different herbs all in the same pot. And you notice they're in a nice sunny spot. And if we just go around again to identify the herbs, in the lower left we have rosemary, then we have oregano, then the purplish plant is a purple sage. Right next to that, it's kind of hard to see, but there's some basil, just basic English basil, the smoother leaves, green leaves that are sort of in the back. Then the ribbed leaves that are very predominant in the front here on the upper right is mint, and then the little tiny leaves are thyme again. And so putting them all in one pot, they're probably, I've never done that honestly, but they're probably not all going to get that overwhelmingly big, and there you are, you have your herb garden right there. Okay, so we already talked about the fact that this is basil. One thing about basil and any of these herbs really is when you're growing them, you do want to put them in a sunny spot. If you have kind of a garden area or a bed area that is shadier, I'm not saying that the herbs won't grow, but they will definitely do better with at least 6 hours of sunlight a day. And if you're going to grow them indoors, the same, you would want them to have a space where they can get a fair amount of sunlight. And while we might start the seeds ourselves, or we might purchase them from a garden center, this again is basil. Often you can purchase these early in the season at the farmer's market. You can purchase the herb plants as well. And this is just a fun idea for planting herbs and flowers together. So the herbs, this looks like flat leaf parsley, might be more ornamental, or we might actually go ahead and cut it and use it in cooking, but we have it in a pot along with the flower. if you are putting plants in, many of you are gardeners that have logged on to this, so you know that you wouldn't want to stick them in the ground until the last chance of frost has passed. If you have chives in an herb bed right now, they're just going great guns, aren't they? And they don't care that it's been snowing. They don't care that it's gotten cold. And now actually is a lovely time to harvest those chives. If you want to do any drying or freezing of the chives, now would be a very nice time to do that because they haven't gone to seed yet. And again, you don't have space in your garden or in your beds. Any old pot, you can put a combination of different chives and different herbs, and don't they look lovely? And I don't know if you can tell, but they actually have kind of a combination of perennial and annual herbs. Most of them are annuals, but it looks like they have some chives in there which are a perennial, and maybe some thyme in there that's a perennial, so, or could be a perennial. So anyhow, a nice combination. Going on to talk about growing herbs, I was just going to mention mint, and I do apologize that I don't really know anything about wild mint, but as I said, if you grow mint, it sometimes will be pretty pervasive, or I don't want to say invasive, but it can really grow. It can really take over. So one little tip that has been given over the years on maybe helping to control the growth of mint is put it in a pot that doesn't have any drainage holes in it, and should be about at least 12 inches diameter on top, and actually kind of bury that pot. You want to leave maybe an inch or so above the ground of the pot, but actually just bury it. It's just to try to contain the running of those roots all over your garden or your flower bed or your herb bed or whatever it is that you have. You might need to water it a bit more because it's in that pot. And then when we talk about health benefits, I started this presentation by saying that, you know, those of us that are on this presentation today, we all work for extension services. We all are providing research-based information. And so we do hear things about herbs that might indicate there are some health benefits. What I'm going to talk about today, though, are really maybe more the health benefits of cooking with herbs, the health benefits that you get from an actual herb. Some of the research is very solid, some of it is less solid. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're really just going to talk about the health benefits of cooking with herbs. So here we have some roasted vegetables, and the notion here is you could use less salt, less seasoning like that, and use more herbs to season the roasted vegetables. And if we think about that, so these are the types of spices or herbs that might be used if you're trying to cut back on sugar. And so I just used the terms spices and herbs as if they were the same thing, as if they were interchangeable. Of course they're not. And what we have listed here are all spices. And so spices generally come from the seed of the herb plant that is dried and often ground. And so earlier when people were talking about what they would like to grow, for example, turmeric would be an example of a spice. Curry would be an example of a spice that, of course, curry contains, you know, different spices. So we may not be able to grow the spices here in the Midwest. The herbs come from the leaves of the plant, and that's what we're probably a little bit more likely to be able to grow. Although if we think about this, there are certain types of basil or mint, for example, that have some of these kind of flavors combined with the mint flavors. So they might be able to be used in a dish that you are trying to reduce the sugar. And mint is not actually listed here, but I sometimes chop mint very finely and put it into a dish that I've reduced the sugar in. If you want to reduce the salt and fat, we often think of adding more savory flavors. So what we have listed here are a combination of spices and herbs. And certainly there would be plenty of others too that we might think of. And here's an idea if you're cooking pasta, but not just pasta. It could be if you're cooking rice or quinoa or another grain. that you're going to use in a savory dish. If you are boiling potatoes or steaming potatoes, you could add any of these fresh herbs or dried herbs to the cooking water. And if you are in the habit of usually adding salt to that, this would be an option then of not having to add the salt at all, or at least not as much salt, by using some of these savory herbs or spices. And then just a word of caution, when we buy herb mixes in the grocery store, many of them, the first ingredient is salt. So if your idea of using the herb mix was to reduce sodium, it might backfire on you. So check the labels on these before you purchase them if your goal was to reduce salt. All right, so let's go into a little bit about cooking with herbs. I guess before I do, I'll stop for just a second and ask if there have been any questions or comments that we should share.
We do have a couple, not necessarily, as people are listening and thinking back on things, we have a gentleman who I know, and I believe he knows quite a bit about herbs, and he says that the fruit of wild mint can be toxic if ingested in large quantities. So that might be something that we need to keep in mind. And I think there was one more. Oh, basil and mint are from the same family, so they can be used as a savory replacement.
Oh, that's a nice tip. And thank you also for sharing with us your knowledge about wild mint. That's good to know. All right, so let's move on to talk about cooking with herbs. And if you have access to herbs that you are growing yourself, and specifically now I'm talking about growing herbs outside, the best time to harvest them is really similar to the best time to cut flowers. The best time to harvest vegetables is first thing in the morning, preferably when the dew has dried a bit, but before the sun is beating down on it. And I mean, obviously we all have our own work schedules and life schedules to work around, and I'm not going to say that I've always been able to harvest my herbs at that time of the day, but that definitely is the best time of the day. Now, all the herbs will go to seed, but annual herbs especially will, go to seed. And so the recommendation here is to pinch off that seed head as quickly as you can, the flower head, because it will keep the herb, gives it, once it flowers, and then especially once it goes to seed, the flavor isn't quite as delicate, the texture isn't quite as delicate, but especially the flavor. And that's actually why I mentioned if you wanted to do some preserving of chives right now is actually a good time to do that if you have chives growing in your herb bed, because it's going to be a little while, but they go to flower and seed very, very quickly. So now is a good time to do that before any of those flower heads have developed. And again, I'm not going to say that I haven't cooked. Well, I've definitely cooked with herbs after they have flowered and after they've gone to seed. But I've even preserved some herbs after they have flowered and after they've gone to seed. I try not to, but if that's the way life works out, then that's what I do. Once you've harvested fresh herbs, there's a variety of different ways you might want to store them. I mean, you could just think about if you were to go to the grocery store and purchase some fresh herbs right now today, they would be in a little plastic, usually they're in a little plastic clamshell with holes in it. Or some of them that people purchase larger quantities of, like parsley or cilantro, might just be open, kind of clustered together like a bouquet, and sometimes the stems of those are down in water, and all of them would be in a refrigerated case, right? So we can just kind of think about that when we harvest herbs ourselves or bring them home fresh from the farmer's market. Store them in an open or perforated bag in the refrigerator, in the crisper drawer for a few days. I mean, honestly, sometimes I just make a bouquet in my kitchen. I just have a bouquet of basil or whatever I've brought in, and I don't even refrigerate it, but it will last longer if you do have it in the refrigerator. And as far as the perforated bag, you can make that yourself, can't you? You could just take any kind of a bag. I would usually probably use a Ziploc storage bag and just take a scissors and cut some holes in it with a scissors and stick my herbs inside that. We do want to wash herbs before we use them, and when you use herbs, you don't want them to be wet, do you? And so this is just showing giving the herbs a good rinse, and just like we often say with fruits and vegetables, give them a shower, not a bath. If you soak them, because the leaves are pretty delicate, they'll probably reduce the shelf life, and also they might get kind of slimy and mushy on you. So it's always best to just rinse them very well in a colander. And then to dry them, you can put them in a salad spinner if you have that, and just kind of spin them out. And that, with centrifugal force, spins those herbs around, and the water ends out in the outer portion of that appliance, and the leaves are much drier then. And you also could just lay them out on a paper towel and kind of dry them that way as well. We're going to talk just a little bit about you know, how you might want to cut herbs. And one thing with herbs, you do want to have a nice sharp knife, because if your knife is dull, it kind of bruises the herbs a little bit. They don't look quite as nice. Here they're just showing chives that you can cut them with the scissors. You can kind of bundle them up and cut them with a sharp knife on a cutting board. Some of the different stores and catalogs now are selling what they call herb scissors. I don't have a picture of that, but it's like having 4 blades in a scissors instead of 1. And that also is kind of as long as the herb is dry, that's also a kind of a nice handy way if you just want, for example, if you just wanted to have some chives to garnish some scrambled eggs or something like that, an herb scissors would be kind of a handy way to do that, but definitely not a requirement for using herbs. And here we have cilantro, parsley, and other small leaf delicate herbs, and you can just remove the leaves by hand, but it's also fine to consume the stems. And someone asked earlier about a puree or even like a smoothie. It's fine to put those stems in there. And when I cook with, in particular, cilantro and parsley, I rarely will remove the leaves from the stem. I just chop the stem up and include it with the cooking. And a lot of times I've heard native Latino cooks say that the stem has the most flavor in it. So you certainly can remove the little leaves, but you do not have to. And this is just showing an easy way to remove those tiny little leaves from thyme. And you can see that the person is just, with their fingers, just going to kind of strip that off. You can also do that with tarragon. You can also do that with rosemary. So any of the, and you can see she's starting at the bottom and she's kind of going backwards against the leaves. So the leaf then easily strips off. It's easier to do with these herbs that have a little bit sturdier stem on them.
Renee, we did have a question about parsley. Is there a difference between flat and curly parsley?
They are 2 different varieties and they look different. The flat is what I have shown in the pictures earlier that have a little bit more look like cilantro, and then the curly leaf, maybe you've seen that on like a garnish at a restaurant or something. And I also feel that the flavor is a little bit different as well. So the flat leaf parsley is often associated with Italian cooking. I guess I've grown both in my garden, so I think they both grow fairly well around here. To me, the curly leaf parsley has a little bit stronger of a parsley, or maybe a traditional parsley type taste, but that could just be me.
We do have another question about herbs with woody stems, and can we put them in, like for a stew or a soup, put them in there, and then do we need to take those out?
Yes, you definitely want to take them out, just like throwing in a bay leaf. You would definitely, if you threw in some, a rosemary sprig or a thyme sprig, you would definitely want to take that out. And then this is just showing tarragon leaves, and again, a chef knife. If we were at the garden show, we could demonstrate the cutting with the chef knife, but we won't be able to do that today. Here we have a bit of a demonstration. So you notice that she is gripping the chef knife there. Actually, her fingers have moved down onto the blade, which is one way to do it. Another way to do it is to keep the hand back on the handle. The one way that you don't want to do it is you don't want to have your hand on the handle with like your index finger pointing forward on the blade, because that doesn't give you as good of control. But this is a really lovely demonstration of chopping up, I think it's those tarragon leaves. And then you can also take leaves that are a little bit bigger, like basil or mint or sage, and you can create what they call a chiffonade. And I'm just going to show you what she does. So she rolls the leaf, and then when she slices it like that, she has a nice kind of a ribbon, kind of a nice little narrow ribbon, which is really nice for garnishing. Or, for example, when I make pizza, I usually chiffonade the basil leaves, and then after I take the pizza out of the oven, I'll sprinkle those on top. So it's I like to do that with the basil leaves on the pizza because it gives the flavor of the fresh basil leaves all over the pizza, rather than if I just put the whole leaf down, might be a little more spotty. Often people are asking questions when they want to cook with fresh herbs. How do we substitute fresh herbs for dried herbs in a recipe? Because many of our recipes call for dried herbs, don't they? So the general guideline is you use 2 to 3 times as much of the fresh herb as what the recipe calls for the dried herb. And I always start, the first time I make that recipe and I substitute a fresh herb with it, I always just double it. And then if I think it's not quite enough, I will add 3 times, because I have found that not everyone is quite as wild about the fresh herb taste as I am. You know, for myself, I might start with 3 times right away. So the example I have is if your recipe called for a teaspoon of dried crushed thyme, then you could put in 2 to 3 teaspoons of thyme leaves. And so just like that picture we had where the person was stripping those tiny little thyme leaves off of the stem, you could put then 2 to 3 teaspoons of that in there. Now there's another trick for cooking with fresh herbs, and that's to look at what type of herb is it. In general, no matter what type of herb it is, for the most part, you really don't want to add the herb much more than the last 15 to 20 minutes of the cooking. But delicate herbs, these are the ones that really you only want to add maybe for the last minute or two, or maybe just sprinkle them on or stir them in after the food is actually finished cooking. So these are the herbs that we call delicate herbs: mint, parsley, chives, basil, dill, cilantro. Some of these are stronger flavored than others, obviously. Dill, even if you cook with it, you can usually have a fairly strong dill flavor, but some of these are definitely less strong. Chives, I think, is an example of one that if you would put that in a dish and actually cook with it and it had extended amount of time for heat, it would probably, you know, you probably wouldn't be able to taste it. Whereas like in the picture here, they've just sprinkled the fresh chopped chives over this bowl of soup, and it's going to have a nice flavor because you didn't cook the chives at all. So just keep that in mind when using these more delicate herbs. And so, for example, here's a pizza that after the pizza is baked, completely baked, they sprinkled the basil leaves on top of the pizza. And this is where I say that I do the chiffonade method of cutting that basil. And so I have a lot more fresh basil sprinkled all over the pizza, but I don't have it in the full leaves. I've basically sliced it into those nice little ribbons. Okay, if there's no other questions or comments, I'll move on to the less delicate herbs. These are the sturdier ones: sage, rosemary, oregano, thyme. So they will last a bit longer in flavoring when you are cooking with them. They still recommend probably not adding them into the last 15 to 20 minutes of cooking. But some of the foods that we are going to cook this way, we might only cook for 15 to 20 minutes. Like when I mentioned adding herbs to your potato water or to your pasta water, you might only be cooking that for 10, 12 minutes anyhow, especially something like pasta. So that would be completely fine to have like a few sprigs of thyme in that, or some rosemary or something like that. And sage, now sometimes we think of sage and rosemary and like taking the whole stem and putting them into the cavity of like the chicken or the turkey that you're roasting. And you definitely can do that at the beginning if you want to. I sometimes do, but then usually the last 20 minutes or so of baking, I will stick some more fresh inside that cavity. If you're roasting vegetables with some of these less delicate herbs, you could, have them on your baking sheet with your veggies, have the sprigs of whichever, rosemary, oregano, thyme, sage, whichever you wanted, all a combination of all three, whatever. And then bake those. Usually you're not going to bake those for more than 10 or 15 minutes anyhow. And then when you remove them from the baking sheet or your roasting pan, you would leave the herbs on the tray for the most part. So this is a resource that we have through Iowa State Extension. It's called Spend Smart, Eat Smart. We have a lot of recipes on this resource, and one of them is called Easy Roasted Vegetables. And so what I'm going to attempt to do here is stop sharing this presentation screen and actually go to the Spend Smart screen. And Carol, if there's any questions or comments while I'm doing that.
We have had a few questions along the way that we didn't get to, and one of them is stevia. Are you going to talk about stevia at some point?
I'm not actually going to talk about stevia. I have noticed that it is very readily available now in the garden centers and in the catalogs. So stevia is an herb that I would like to try. I haven't tried it, but it is an herb that they do make artificial sweeteners out of it, and kind of has a sweeter taste. So I would like to try it, and I would like to use it in a way that I currently use mint often, where I chop it really fine and then I add it to like fruit salads or things like that. Does anyone else that's listening in know more about stevia or have experience growing stevia or cooking with stevia?
We have had some discussion about growing turmeric back and forth between a few people about the turmeric makes a rhizome and that it takes a long time to be able to grow. So if you want to grow it, you start it in December.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then we had some questions earlier about saving seed and growing from seed. And if you want to just talk briefly, maybe about a little bit about it, because I'm sure that's probably not something you're covering.
No, nor is it something that I'm an expert in. Probably the master gardeners on the session here today can give more information on that. But I do sometimes save seeds from some of my herbs and just dry them and plant them the next year. I don't always do that. Sometimes I'm just lazy and order them from a catalog. That's usually what I do, but I have saved some of the seeds. I don't really have much else to say about that, honestly. Obviously, you would probably start doing that when you were kind of done, using the herb and you had completely let it go to seed.
I do know if anybody needs dill seed, they can email me. I can get you a whole bunch. I have a lot that I saved last year.
That is the most common seed that I save as well, is dill.
Yeah. And we had a comment earlier about somebody growing dill for butterflies. So it's another use of herbs.
You know what? You're right. And the other thing that I noticed, particularly last year when there was that moth that was so prevalent, it absolutely loved the sage, not the sage, the oregano after I let it go to bloom, let it flower. Those moths absolutely loved that flowering oregano, and bees as well really love the flowering oregano. So that's fun to see.
Yeah, Caitlin put a link in for saving seeds from Iowa State. Caitlin, would you also put up the Spend Smart, Eat Smart website, and then they can copy that off if they'd like to?
So they're putting the link for this website in the chat box, but right now, Carol, can you see the Spend Smart, Eat Smart website?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm going to click on recipes, and we kind of have some rules for the recipes that we are willing to post on this site and use in our nutrition education program. They have to be, a little lower in sodium, a little lower in fat, a little lower in calories per serving, a little higher in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, that type of thing. And so I am going to just click on side dishes here. They're also fairly economical and usually have ingredients that a lot of people are familiar with using and might even have in their kitchen. It's a great source for people that are sort of stuck at home right now to get some economical, easy recipes. And some of the recipes have videos for preparation as well. But I'm going to click on Easy Roasted Veggies right now, this particular recipe, and bring this recipe up. So you can see that it is calling for 5 cups of kind of any variety of vegetable that you have, a little bit of oil, and then it calls for 2 teaspoons of dried Italian seasoning, and then a little bit of pepper and a little bit of salt. So let's just talk about Italian seasoning. You can really make that any way you want to, but often it has a combination of thyme and basil, oregano. If you made it yourself, you certainly could put some rosemary in it. I mean, really, you can kind of make that Italian seasoning any way you want to, but we do think of oregano, we think of basil, we think of thyme as possibly being some of the main ingredients in that. Now, in this recipe for roasted veggies, you can see that we're going to preheat the oven to 425, and then we put the oil on the veggies, we put the dried seasonings on it, and we bake it. It says bake it to 20 to 40 minutes, stirring every 10 minutes. The veggies would have to be in pretty big chunks to require a 40-minute time frame. But let's say we wanted to substitute fresh herbs for this. So what are the 2 things we would need to think about if we want to substitute fresh herbs for what they're calling 2 teaspoons of dried Italian seasoning? I'm going to give you a second to put in the chat box, what are the things that we need to think about when we think about how to do this substitution?
Renee, I think they're thinking hard about it. Oh, here's one. Quantity.
Yes. Okay. So if
Times the amount with fresh.
Yes. Okay. So if we use the guideline that I gave you, remember we said 2 to 3 times the amount as the person entered in the chat. So if it's 2 teaspoons of dried Italian seasoning, we probably want to at least use 4 teaspoons of our, and I would say for this, we probably want to chop the seasoning up fairly finely so that it could be possibly distributed over the veggies here. So at least 4 teaspoons, maybe 5, maybe 6, all right? It depends on how strong we want to make that. I would probably start with 4 teaspoons, all right? What other comments do we have, Carol?
Well, they did talk about making them fine, but they also talked about the timing of when you put it on.
Very good. Okay, so we need to then think about what kind of herb are we using, right? So remember we said basil is a very delicate herb, whereas oregano, rosemary, or any other, maybe like if you were going to use, I don't know if you would use sage for this, but those are the non-delicate herbs. So those you could put in, like let's just say if we were going to stick with the 3 basic, basil, rosemary, basil, oregano, and thyme. So the oregano and the thyme leaves, you could actually add, no, I probably only bake this for 10 or 15 minutes because I probably have the vegetables cut a little bit smaller. So I could add those right at the very beginning of the baking. If you thought you were going to bake it a little longer, you maybe could add those halfway through. But maybe the basil you wouldn't want to sprinkle on until you were actually taking it out of the oven and kind of stirring it to combine it, because that is a delicate herb. So great, you guys came up with that. That's what we always need to consider when we look at a recipe that contains a dried herb and we want to substitute a fresh herb. So we need to think about the quantity, and then we need to think about the type of herb. Does it fall in the category of a delicate herb that we would add at the very end, or is it a bit sturdier herb that we could maybe add for the last 15 minutes or so? Alrighty. So I am going to stop my share on that. That just gave us one little opportunity to think about that. I'm going to go back to our presentation here. Is the screen up that says let's practice? Oops.
It is.
Okay. So now let's just talk about just some general things. And you know, I have found that if I go online and I just ask for ideas for cooking with herbs or fresh rosemary. I will get ideas. I have found that in many cookbooks that I have, there are charts that have like ideas for what herbs to put with what foods. So that's really what this is. If you raise or have access to fresh rosemary, these are common types of foods that people like to put them with. And that's just what I'm going to run through now, is just some of that basic information that we often see in cookbooks or on websites or wherever. With basil, of course, we frequently think of that with tomatoes. We might think of it with pesto, where we're combining basil leaves and some olive oil and maybe some garlic and some seasoning to that. Or sometimes people will substitute parsley for the basil, or sometimes they'll do half parsley or cilantro, or a lot of these different herbs, or half basil, half spinach, a lot of different types of pesto that you can make. But we do think of basil often associated with some of the dishes that have a little bit more of an Italian flair to them. Dill is great on fish. It's great with veggies. It's great with potatoes. Lots of different ways to use dill. We sometimes have dips that we make that we put dill in. And then parsley. They say on here that the flat leaf is more strongly flavored. I always feel like the curly leaf is more strongly flavored, but either way, you can use it as a garnish. It's often used in soups. But again, if it's calling for dried parsley, the recipe might call for you to add that at the beginning of the mixing the soup together. But if you're going to substitute fresh parsley, you would want to stir that in at the very end. Cilantro, same thing. Some people don't like cilantro. They say about 20% of the population, cilantro tastes like soap. So some people aren't that wild about cilantro, but we often associate it with Asian or Indian or Mexican or Caribbean cooking. Oregano, again, with some of the dishes maybe that have a little bit more of an Italian flair. Mint is good with veggies. I like to chop it up real fine and put it in with fresh fruit in the summertime. Someone had mentioned earlier, like substituting basil and mint back and forth in the same recipe. I sometimes substitute parsley and mint back and forth in the same recipe. And of course, you can make mint tea. You can just pour hot water over your mint leaves. If you kind of crush those leaves a little bit, they will put a little bit more flavor in your tea as you're steeping it. And you could just make mint tea, or you could combine that with another type of tea, green tea or black tea, and add the crushed mint leaves to that. Tarragon with eggs and meats, fish, chicken, thyme. Lots of different things we might use thyme for. Sage, I think we think of poultry, but certainly it's good with potatoes, it's good with pork. They list summer squash, but I have quite a few recipes with winter squash in which sage is incorporated. And we are kind of running to the end of our time. Carol, would you like me to talk about freezing and drying, or would you like me to stop and see if there are questions?
I do have one question, and then we can go on. Are there different types of dill and cilantro that one grows for the seed versus the leaves? And I'm not sure that you would know that, but if somebody else knows it, if they'd write it in the chat.
Yeah, you are absolutely correct. I don't know. And if someone else could lend their expertise, that'd be great. So herbs can be dried in a variety of ways. You can just bundle them up and hang them in a place where they're going to get air, but not too much direct sunlight, and also not dirt and dust blowing on them. You can dry them in a dehydrator. Some herbs, if you're just going to dry a small quantity, you can dry in a microwave. I prefer drying in the dehydrator. It's a very consistent way to dry, and you can dry a fairly large quantity at once. Although keep in mind, if I have this dehydrator full of basil leaves, when they come out and I crush them up a little bit with my hands, I'm going to have at most a half pint jar, or in other words, a cup of basils. So it's always surprising when it dries, isn't it, how much smaller. You can also freeze herbs. So you put your herbs, here we have thyme leaves, but you put them in like an ice cube tray, and you can either put water on them or oil on them. And then when you go to cook them, cook with them, you just pop that whole cube, whether it's water or oil, into your dish. And some people have said, well, why would I want to add that extra water, or why would I want to add that extra oil? It's such a small amount. Honestly, like, let's just say if you chopped up some cilantro and you put it either in water or oil when you froze it, if you were adding that to a fresh salsa that you were making, you honestly really wouldn't even notice that little bit of extra water or oil in there. Some of the, especially if you have oil on them, they do turn white when you freeze them, or sometimes they turn yellow when you freeze them. And what I do is after I've frozen them, then I would pop those little cubes out of the tray, put them in a Ziploc bag, and label them and put them in the freezer. And then the rest of this presentation is just showing us some recipe ideas. So Carol, you feel free to give any comments or questions that people have, and I'm just going to bring some things up on the screen. This is a dish called tabbouleh, and you can put parsley or mint or both in it. It's usually eaten cold, but you could probably eat it hot as well. Basil chiffonades. This is pesto. You're blending that up, the basil leaves or parsley or whatever you wanted to use.
We have one question about the tabbouleh. Do you know anything about making bulgur from wheat berries?
I just follow the directions on the package. And that's the first step in making tabbouleh, is to, and it's, you know, cooked similar to other types of grains. So I've never found an instant version of it, but there certainly might be. So other than following the directions on the package, I don't know anything else about it.
We do have one person that talked about the acidic, your body pH depends whether cilantro tastes like lime or like soap.
Oh, interesting. This is a fun way to use dill, not the seed, the feathery part, on cucumbers and on fish. Sometimes parsley is used interchangeably with cilantro as well. And sometimes I take a fresh cilantro mix, and instead of putting cilantro in it, I put fresh basil in it, and then I have more of a, you know, bruschetta. I call it bruschetta cilantro, but it really has more of a bruschetta flavor in it with the fresh basil. So if you were making a pasta sauce as pictured here, and you were adding fresh oregano to that, you might actually, especially if you were making it from fresh garden tomatoes, you might actually cook that pasta sauce for quite a while. But remember, you don't want to add that fresh oregano. Even though it is a sturdier herb, you don't want to add it till about the last 10 to 15 minutes. And then the rest of my pictures are just pictures of using herbs as edible garnishes in all the different forms that we might have. They look beautiful and inviting and really spark up a dish. So Carol, that's all I have for this morning, and Caitlin.
If anybody does have another question, if you want to go ahead and type it in now. Notice that Caitlin has put in the evaluation link several different times. If you would copy that out for us, we would really appreciate it.
I do actually have one more thing to add. You may have noticed on some of the photos that Alice Henneman is credited with taking the photos. And actually this presentation that I just did for you is adapted with Alice's permission. She is a retired extension educator for the University of Nebraska. And she did give us permission to use her presentation and her information in any way that we wanted to, as long as we gave credit to her and gave credit to the University of Nebraska Extension. So we thank Alice so much for allowing us to use this great presentation and especially her wonderful photos.
Alice was well known for that, and she still, if you happen to go onto Facebook and see, I think a lot of her posts are such that you can see them. She still is posting lots about cooking and about doing things like that. She loves that.
Thank you everyone for joining us today.
I do have one question on pasta sauce. If I can, it would be, so talking about canning and oregano. So should you wait if you're canning to put the oregano in after you can and when you open the can, or should you put it in when you can?
Well, we know if we're going to can a pasta sauce, usually that is going to be pressure canned. I mean, there could be some recipes that are water bath. I'm just going to put in a plug for what we always say about food preservation. You need to use a tested recipe. Now, either way, whether your recipe, and I do think that most pasta sauces will be pressure canned, but either way, even if it was a tested recipe that was a water bath recipe, it's a high heat for an extended amount of time. So the flavor in any of these fresh herbs really is not going to hold up for the canning process. So you're absolutely right. You would want to add fresh oregano to that pasta sauce after you've opened the jar and then you're cooking it for actually making and serving the pasta for the meal.
All right. Caitlin, did you have some last words you would like to say?
Yeah, first thing was I was looking into the question about dill on the different varieties of dill. And from the quick research that I did, I couldn't find that you would necessarily grow one versus the other for seeds, their leaves, different things like that. I think, you know, if you're to grow like a mammoth dill, it's just to have more dill because it's much larger. So that's kind of what I was running into on the quick research that I did just to help answer that question.